right, let's hold on one second. I'm trying to adjust my screen here. All the technology. All right, let's get started. Well, I want to say to everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight for such a critical topic in our city right now. And tonight's topic is one that requires a lot of thought and reflection and conversation, but ultimately action here in our city too. Because we have seen the way in which throughout this pandemic, right now, of course, the shocking and really disgusting rise in hate crimes against our Asian American communities. And this has been going on since the beginning of the pandemic because of the influence of Donald Trump before and so many others that were just spewing such racist hatred and xenophobia right from the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And is now a huge uptick again in hate crimes and violence against our Asian communities. In the face of all of this, there have been organizations on the ground, in particular the Asian American Federation, that has really led the way in standing up and bringing our city together to stand up in solidarity to root out and combat this kind of hate in our communities and in our city. In fact, just this past weekend, JoAnn, Meera, and so many of the Asian American Federation had a really powerful rally in Foley Square in the city with so many who came together in such a powerful display of solidarity and strength, saying that we will not be divided as communities and we will fight together and stand together to protect our Asian communities. And I remember in that, in the rally itself, hearing from Noel Quintana, a victim of a hate crime himself, earlier in the month on the subway, who was slashed by someone on the train. And he spoke so powerfully and movingly at the rally. His presence itself was such an inspiration to me and to so many others to hear his words that day as well, and to hear from so many others and to feel that energy of our city standing together and sending a message powerfully across the world, frankly, that we will not tolerate this kind of hate in our communities. My name is Shekar Krishnan. I'm running for city council here in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, Queens. And we've been having our weekly conversations every Wednesday or Thursday to talk about different issues, the most critical issues affecting our city at this time of crisis. And this is one that has simply skyrocketed to the forefront, given all the violence that we're seeing around our city. The biggest question being, of course, what is our response in the face of such hate? And how do we make sure that we are actually rooting out and removing this hate from our communities, not simply watching it, not simply adding more police officers to respond to it, but how do we truly root out this hate from our communities? And the ones doing the work really at the forefront in our city are those at the Asian American Federation, which is why I'm so proud and so excited to introduce today two of our panelists, JoAnn Yoo, the Executive Director of the Asian American Federation, and Meera Nair, Associate Director for the Asian American Federation. Two powerhouses who I look up to so much in our city, Meera right here in Jackson Heights too, who are doing such incredible work always for our Asian American communities, but in particular right now have simply led the response across the world, frankly, in bringing attention to what's happening in New York City and in how we respond to it. So they have really been so powerful in their work, and it's really showing right now too, of course, as it has throughout all the work of AAF too on so many different fronts. So with that in mind, I'm so pleased to introduce both JoAnn and Meera, and we'll turn it over for a discussion for the first maybe 20 minutes or so with some questions to understand the gravity of the moment right now and our response to it. And then from there to hear questions from you all too in the audience. So if you have questions you want to put in the chat, please do so along the way. If you're watching on Facebook Live, please put in the live stream as well, and we'll make sure to get to as many as we can. But without further ado, let's get started with JoAnn and Meera. I wanted to first ask you, JoAnn, maybe you can just talk a bit. We all know, we're all seeing what's happening, but maybe from your vantage point with all that you all are doing, can you talk to us a bit about what exactly is happening in our city now when it comes to anti-Asian hate and hate crimes? What are we seeing? What is this uptick? And can you just characterize for us what has the last couple of months been like for Asian American communities?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. I've never done a panel with Meera, and we talk 50,000 times a day at the office, so it's kind of exciting.
That's right.
And we miss each other very much being in the same space. So Meera, it's good to be on a panel with you. And it's so great to, I realized at Jackson Heights, I got a lot of friends I know. Chuck, how's school, man? How's your dad? And I saw Ken, congrats on the new gig.
Congrats, Ken.
And I know you're going to do awesome things. Anthony Ang, you knew I was going to call you out, so you knew you had to turn that camera on, man.
Hey, Anthony.
And then my small business expert, Ayon Kim, is trying to turn her camera on, but I see her. So it's really great to see all of my own tribe from Jackson Heights here. So it's great to see you guys, and I hope you guys are doing well. So what we're seeing, it hasn't been in the last couple of months. The sad part is, I think it's been happening for a while. And, you know, if you even take a step back to like everyday life pre-COVID, you know, think about all the microaggressions against our community, right? Like it's always like, your English is so good. Where are you from? You know, there's always this othering that our community has endured. And it's always about, you know, we're the perpetual foreigners. And we're invisible. And so people it's been easy to ignore the needs of our community. You know, so many media, I mean, because we are just basically the Federation, we're just unafraid because people's lives are at stake. We've been speaking out, which, you know, gets us a lot of conversations in media. And we've been saying, you know, I mean, there's real fear in our community, right? Like people are afraid to go outside. I'm afraid to go outside because people have said stuff to me. And, you know, all of the little comments and the, you know, I mean, you know, honestly, it's 500 recorded instances of hate incidents in New York. And we know that's like a huge undercount because people don't ever complain. And I can't tell you the number of strangers who have called me to tell me their stories about what is happening. And it's just really, really heartbreaking. And, you know, Meera and I, you know, we've, you know, our staff, I think we all take turns crying because it is so gut-wrenching to hear how people are living in fear. And this hasn't been, you know, the hate crime hasn't been in the last couple months. It's been for a year, you know, that we've been walking around with targets on our backs for a year. Because when the news broke last year that, you know, there was a virus that was, you know, discovered in Wuhan, then you knew that, you know, like I remember the day I heard that news and I said, oh my God, here we go, right? And why I said that was, look at the South Asian community, the Muslim Arab community after 9/11, right? You know, think about how they were targeted. And I said, oh my God, this is the East Asian community's turn to be targeted. So this is not new. You know, I think there's a spike because, you know, I don't know, maybe is it more because there's more highlight? Is it more copycat? Is it people feel more emboldened to be able to target? Are we soft targets? I think there are all of those questions. I don't know why people target us. I mean, you know, I think there's a whole lot of factors, but I know that, you know, this is not the first go around, right? Like I think about, you know, I sit and think a lot about like Asian American history, and you know, our history from, you know, day one, we've always been the outsider, and they've also, you know, always been like, oh, you don't belong here, you're somebody else. So it's easy to target us, and you know, the model minority myth really stymies us, and so, you know, we are expected to not complain. We are expected to you know, keep our heads down, and that's the philosophy. You know, many of us on the Zoom, the Asian American, you know, the activists, that's what we were told: keep your head down and don't speak up. So I'm this has been going on for a while, right? The hate crimes, but I think this is not a new thing. And I see Meera, so I'm going to punt it to her.
So I mean, I think what we also have to consider is what makes up the Asian American community, who make up the Asian American community in this city, right? So the Asian American community in New York City is like the antithetical, you know, antithesis to what we consider the Asian American community. Like, we are not the crazy rich Asians, we are the crazy poor Asians. So 1 in 4 people are under the poverty line. 50% do not speak English, meaning, well, you know, they have low English proficiency. Some of our seniors, almost 80% don't speak English well. So and we are immigrants, we have a huge undocumented population. Obviously, people know all of this, or at least they sense it. So they attack thinking that nobody's going to go to the police or are not going to complain. Forget the police. I mean, are just going to quietly take it and go home. And this is, we know from our victims that they don't want to come, they don't want to be. It's very hard to find a victim who will actually speak to the press or speak out. Noel Quintana, who was slashed from year to year, was the one person who was actually willing to stand up at our rally and say, no New Yorker came to my help, which is an indictment of our city. But yeah, we've been seeing there are many factors that make a community, what's happening to our community right now. It's not also COVID. People are frustrated, people have lost jobs, economics, all of that. And we know in the history of this country, when the mainstream population or people are feeling frustrated, they're trying to find a scapegoat. So we are being scapegoated in some ways, so one little tiny virus is being replaced by this community that they have found, and which our leadership conflated together by calling it all these horrible names, the China virus and the Wuhan virus. And I think that's what's happening.
And I think both of you make such powerful points. JoAnn, I think it was really important that you highlighted how this is not something new, right? That the way that the media just picks up on it now actually reflects a larger visibilization because it's been going on for so long in these instances of hate. And all of a sudden now the media trains its eye on it, where so many instances get unreported during COVID, but even before COVID too. But I think there are two levels that I wanted to just emphasize a bit too, or explore more. Both COVID and then also the more fundamental points you both mentioned about being invisibilized and the model minority myth as well, and some of the statistics that you mentioned, Meera. But let's take one at a time. I think first, as you said so well, JoAnn, too, this is not just 2 months, but this has been going on throughout the pandemic since the very beginning, encouraged by so many, even electeds going up to Trump himself before, but spewing this kind of racism and hatred, even when they talked about COVID itself too, right? From the very, very early stages, before we even knew much as a city about how devastating this virus would be, they were already talking in racist terms about it. And, one question I have is, because it's been going on for so long, because there have been recent attacks, it would seem like government at the city level, for sure, but also, let's put aside the federal government or states, but at least at the city and state level, this has been an ongoing issue for so long now, at least over a year at this point, that they must have had some sort of response, some sort of way to address this and combat hate. So I'm curious for you, as a starting point, what has been the response of city and state government since the beginning of the pandemic and up till now to address these issues that we're all been raising in different ways?
Shekar, that's a loaded question, man.
Well,
You're gonna get me in trouble.
I didn't need to open it up so loaded, but I wanted some real talk here.
Sure. So we've been, those of us who've been doing this work for a while, we knew exactly how this was going to play out, right? And so we raised the red flag very early on, January, February of last year, and said, you guys better get in front of this thing, right? And why I raised that is because when we're all had the privilege of staying at home and working from home, the people who were out working were the people who are the low wage workers, the essential workers, people who don't speak the language. There's nobody around, there's no bystander, right? Like they were just they're so vulnerable. And I would literally have nightmares about like, oh my God, what is going to happen, right? Just so much of, my worst imagination, it's even beyond that. So I did raise, so yes, as advocates, we all raised the flag very early. Response was slow. I remember having a lot of very sharp conversations that actually, I have to tell you, City Hall was really good about opening the doors and like setting up meetings, right? And a lot of hard conversations, a lot of sharp conversations, a lot of F-bombs, honestly. And ultimately, I think that's where the Asian Hate Task Force, Asian Hate Task Force was formed, because part of it also was people were not reporting it. But people were not, and the response is always like, if it's not life threatening, then you have to call 311, right? 311 cannot be the panacea for everything in New York City. And so where people ended up doing was going to the nonprofits and telling them. And so there are some of our member agencies, they have long lists of, and then on this day, this is what happened. And this is on this day, this is what happened. We were on a call with NYPD where I basically try not to scream, but I screamed at them. But they were saying, call 311. And one of the nonprofits on the call said, we've been trying to get through 311 for the last half hour because somebody just walked in here to report somebody getting punched. So like, I understand that we're in a pandemic, but that 311 was used to order food. 311 was to, 311 did everything. That's 311. Those are three magic numbers that didn't do crap, right? And so, yeah, it's hard not to be angry because some of us did, 9/11 rebuilding work, and we knew exactly what this was going to happen, and this is exactly what is happening. And to be honest, I'm trying to figure out how to give some grace to people, right? Because I can only imagine being a leader at this time and having to navigate a global pandemic, because it's all scary. We've never done this before, right? But some of the things that we saw from 9/11, the lessons learned, that could have been rolled out. Teaching people the rights, teaching people safety, teaching people, connecting people to have better communications with law enforcement. I know there's a lot of conversations that we need to have about the role of law enforcement, but if you are a victim of a crime and somebody slashed your face, you kind of need to call the cops. That's just how I think about this. But then if you don't speak the language, then how do you do that? How do you have access to resources out there that can actually help you, right? And so, yeah, I raised a lot of issues. Yeah, we had some really hard conversations. Yeah, I was a psycho. And I don't really care who thinks that, because at some point when you know what's going to happen and you see people who are going to be victimized look like you, and you know that people who are your elected leaders and people who are supposed to lead our city, apparently for me, it's like, you're not doing enough. You're not doing anything. So which means you're not even doing enough. It's really hard not to have a reaction. This is like a trigger for me, right? Like, it just really gets me, because nobody can say, yeah, you never did anything, or you never said anything. I've been screaming from the mountaintops since last January, right? And so what I think about is, how do we, and because maybe it's the calculated gamble of Asians don't complain, Asians are quiet, it's the model minority, right? You guys never demand anything, so maybe we can just be a little slow to respond, right? I don't know what the reason is. I mean, I think you have to ask the city why the response was slow, because from the advocate side, we were not slow. Mm-hmm. And we were even before the city went on quarantine, we raised issues, safety issues. And so,
it's because we also saw what was happening to small businesses. Mm-hmm. That was a huge red flag, because people, we have data on our own, and from a report, because Asian American Federation does a lot of reports on unemployment and on poverty. We are a data-led organization. We tell our stories in different ways. One of the ways we tell our story of our community is through data. Yeah. We discovered that there was a huge drop-off in business in all the Asian enclaves that were identifiably Asian. So people stopped going to Chinatown, stopped going to Flushing, and because they somehow associated the virus with the person behind the counter. And so we knew what was coming. I mean, JoAnn started going, and she had a very public thing with the mayor at one of these restaurants in Chinatown, saying that, trying to, sort of stop that kind of thing from taking hold, the myth from taking hold, that there's something, oh, small businesses and the coronavirus. So I mean, you know, she's really right. We knew this was coming, and we started making noise very, very early. She was, I think, JoAnn, didn't you go on Brian Lehrer on this for like in February, I think, you know? So yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I remember very clearly, JoAnn, when you went on, and you know how you were calling attention to these issues. Even like I said before people even processed what COVID-19 was, the racism started before then too, right? And so, and the drop off in Asian businesses and restaurants started way before then too. And I remember you being out there at the forefront at the very beginning. And before going back to that point, because I think there is, like a lot of what we see in this pandemic, there is the government's response or non-response, and then how community groups and organizations have stepped up. But before going there, I just want to also go a little bit deeper, because I think in talking about how this has been going on for so long, you also both have something very important. It's not even just been through this pandemic itself, right? We can go deeper than that. It's the way in which our communities have been stereotyped and sidelined in so many different ways, invisibilized when it comes to services and resources, complete lack of language access, and the way that we're not taken seriously when it comes to our issues, right? I mean, the case in point right now, but this is a larger social issue of social justice and political issue as well. And I wondered if you could both, Meera, you kind of hinted at that too, if you could talk about that a bit. I mean, I know AF's work has been to highlight some of these things, but how, I think it's good for everyone to hear too, how does the model minority myth in Asian communities affect and hide the true poverty and the true struggles of so many low-income Asian Americans? What is that correlation there? And how does that invisibilizing affect the resources and services, or the lack of thereof, that come to our communities as well? Can you just tie that a bit too? Because I think that's a really important point.
So the modern minority myth, you know, there are lots of people on this call who can explain it better than me. But it's this myth that says, you know, that was created to say, Asian American community, you don't need resources because you are, you know, you are really smart and you're successful and you know how to stand up by yourself. That was a lie told to the Black and Latino community, like, you know, to be able to divide our community, to say, so, hey, Black and brown community, Black and Latino communities, don't, you know, ask for stuff, because be like the Asians. Like, look at them, they don't ask for anything. So you need to be like them. However, Asian American community, as Meera says, high poverty rate, high, you know, immigrant communities, the limited English proficiency. And when government says to you, oh, you're doing well, we don't need to help you, that also dehumanizes the need in our community, right? We can't succeed by ourselves. We need help from government. We need lots of help. And so that myth is a wedge that was created to separate out the Asians from the Black and Latino communities. You know, we have shared interests as people of color, you know, that we are marginalized, and why I just, you know, get so frustrated is, you know, if anything busted open that myth as the stupidest thing ever is this pandemic, right? Like, look who's dying, right? Like, we think about, you know, we're all, you know, it's the Black and the Latino communities and the Asian communities who are having to go to work, right? And the system is not set up for us. And this is what I remind my staff all the time. Don't try to fight the system, because the system was never meant for us. The system was never created for us. So we need to find new ways of working. We need to find new partnerships. We need to think about ways that make sense for our community and to do it the way we think is right. That's how we think about the modern minority myth. It's, you know, and there are so many communities, so many ethnicities in our community who are just suffering from poverty. And yet, you know, the myth says you don't need help because you're going to succeed by yourself, you know, some miraculously, I guess. And the perpetual corner is also that fact that we don't belong here, you know. I have friends who've been here for many, many, many generations. And, you know, I have a group of girlfriends, and when we get together, we always do a check-in about how many times did you get asked, wow, your English is really, really good. It's, where'd you, like, why is it so good? And where are you from? Where are you really from? And what they're asking, I know, is what is your ethnicity? And if they ask that question, what is your ethnicity? It's not offensive, but people ask it and say, where are you from? Why is the assumption that we're not from here? I'm from here, right? I think those are always the way to marginalize the Asian American community, right? We're used as a wedge, we're used as a tool to further disenfranchise Blacks and Latino brothers and sisters. And then the perpetual foreigner is, and on top of that, you're also invisible, right? And so lately I've been saying to people, you need to pick one of these racist tropes, because for us to work against two, it's really, really difficult, right? But this is the reality that we are dealing with right now. This is the belief that we can somehow succeed by ourselves.
It's also because the disproportionate, the gap between the rich and the poor is among the highest in the Asian American community. Also, nobody disaggregates data, so they lump, like, oh, the very successful person you see who is now the CEO of Google or whatever, who that becomes like the face, to the Bhutanese community person who is a perpetual refugee who cannot like do better. There's some of our Tibetan communities, all the new people who have come into this country who are all Asian American but also struggling. They forget that there's one, the poverty is 1 in 4, that at least in, what is it, in New York, 70% of all Asian American people, children live with one immigrant parent. I mean, I can spew data till the cows come home, but that's not what matters. But the fact that they don't see that there is this huge disparity, and so they take the person who is the most successful and make them the face of the community and say, why can't you all be like this? And therefore, you guys don't need anything because you're also rich, and that is what is hugely detrimental to us telling the story of the community in like the real story of the community, right? So because nobody wants to hear it. They're like, oh, you guys are okay. We won't even need to mention you when we talk about brown and black or communities. We are also, people of color. And so why do they make us look as if we are white adjacent or whatever? So that all of that is happening. So.
And also the challenge is that some of the folks even in our own community are so flattered by that myth, right?
Exactly.
What's wrong with that myth? And I'm thinking, do you know how toxic it is? It is really, it's really, pouring poison down our own throats and killing ourselves, right? And in every way, if you think about, the little celebrations that we have, if we've been here for so long, and then like it takes, there's no representation anywhere for us, right? I just look at entire society and how we've just been completely buried and marginalized, under-resourced, invisible. And so of course, people, new immigrants, especially when they encounter a horrific situation, and instead of asking for help, they just don't talk about it because they're afraid. And they also think, well, who do I turn to, right? It is so layer upon layer of frustration, betrayal, oppression, that, it's going to take a while to unpack, but we cannot unpack this alone. It has to be unpacked together.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a powerful point that you make that really gives a deeper historical perspective too, that I think raises also the question to me about solidarity, and solidarity really in two different ways. How to respond to the hate against Asian American communities right now, but also how do Asian communities stand in solidarity with so many of our other Black and Brown communities that we need to be standing in solidarity with. As you point out so powerfully, JoAnn, too, that people shouldn't be buying into this model minority myth that was really a tool of white imperialism and white supremacy to divide communities of color, that I think we as Asian Americans need to be so cognizant about too, and do our work to shatter every single day. But let's start with going with that perspective about solidarity. My first question is, in this time right now, how do AAF has been on the front lines of the work to really advocate for how to keep our communities safer in the face of such hate, violence, and crimes too. How do we do so? When we talk about standing in solidarity, everyone with our Asian communities right now, what does that response look like to keep our communities safer without bringing in and centering law enforcement, which I think so powerfully Murad at the NYIC from NYIC had spoke so powerfully to at the rallies, that we cannot police our way out of this problem. So when we think about how to respond to hate crimes, to really root out hate at a deep level, what has AS advocacy been on how we protect our Asian communities? What does that look like? What kind of resources does that involve? And what kind of response does that involve from a perspective of solidarity of all communities?
First, one thing I want to touch on too is, everybody's screaming about like, oh, all of this is fueling like you're fueling Black and Asian hate, right? And I'm thinking, what are you people talking about? It fuels hate between racists and Asians at this point, right? And so I think what media has done, they cherry pick certain stories, right? And so they'd be able to fit this narrative, and they're fanning the flames. And I refuse to play that, right? Because in my neighborhood, it's not Black people saying anything to me, it's white people saying stuff to me and making me feel afraid. And so and this is not a Black Asian fight, and I greatly resent that, having been portrayed that way. What keeps our community safe? We keep our community safe. We're looking at ambassador programs, right? We need to be able to connect people. I mean, first and foremost, there needs to be more resources for nonprofit organizations, right? There needs to be I think coming out of this pandemic, we need to figure out what is it that we are going to prioritize to build a city that makes sense, right? And everybody is so excited to go back to to normal. But like, I'm thinking like, I've been telling everybody, I don't want to go back to normal, because normal did not work for people. It did not work for people of color. It did not work for low-income people. It did not work it only serves rich people. It does not serve people who look like us, like many of us on this Zoom. So what will we prioritize? And I think that ultimately is a safety question of social services, right? Mental health. If you think about it, I mean, at some point, we've been really working to raise mental health awareness and ask for funding. Now, for the Asian American community to destigmatize what mental health looks like, right? Now, at this point, we're going to need to figure out mental health for the entire country, because we've all been home. We've seen our friends and family pass away. We've unprecedented unemployment. We're working from home. We're anxious. I mean, everything is a trigger for us, right? All of the hate incidents for the Asian American community. So mental health is going to be a huge deal. Some of the perpetrators, have mental health needs themselves. And when I think about what that means, it's like the system failed them too, right? Because had we had a proper healthcare system, they could have gotten help for this. But now some of them have live in fragile, housing infrastructure, right? I don't know what all the perpetrators' situation is, but we need investments to prevent people with mental illnesses from harming themselves and other people. We need better victim services. I don't think victims even know what their rights are. What happens? I was on a call with Noel, and he said his concern was, what do I do about how do I get a police report so I can file something, right? Like, I was thinking, oh my God, please let us do that for you, right? But he doesn't even know what those rights are, and it was so tragic, because that's what's making him panic about his daily survival as a victim versus trying to rest and get the help that he needs, right? We need to have in language. I mean, everything comes down to what we've been all screaming on the Zoom forever: in language, cultural competence, right? In language programming, cultural competent programming. How do we do program to really help people, prevent homelessness? How do we get social services to people? My God, the food issue during the beginning of the pandemic with our seniors.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've seen hardened social workers who've seen everything cry on Zoom because they could not bear what they were having to deal with, right? So how do we dismantle this infrastructure that really doesn't work for anybody, right? And that really laid bare how unfair the structure is. And so, and we need to, for us, we're working on an ambassador program. How do we, create programs where neighbors actually help each other? If you look at, a larger context of like the mutual aid programs that actually happen, those were really powerful because people were checking in on each other and people were feeding each other. That needs to happen in a much larger level that's funded by government. And that is not funded by, sometimes, like I will say, government, we fund, stuff that, is great, but like, really, I'd much rather have food for people. I'd much rather have housing security. I'd much rather have robust social services. I'd rather have healthcare so that people don't feel vulnerable and they don't act out in these situations. I don't know, Meera, if you want to add.
I'm just saying before we get to here, what happens, right? Before we get to this brink, where now our seniors are afraid to leave home, where we are watching videos of seniors being picked up and thrown into the street. And before we get here, what could have been done to resource our communities? What could have been done, so working backwards instead of like, now, oh my God, we are here, now let's throw money at the problem. But before that, what could be done? And all of these things, mental health, more jobs, understanding that there's a pandemic. So can we just help the communities, instead of saying, here's $600, bye-bye, like all these things that are happening. I mean, just think about, there are small businesses who are trying to make a living, and then they have to close early. Like JoAnn, the very famous Chen that everybody knows, has been talking about how he's losing business. He's doing 30% of his business or something because he has to close early because his employees are all being harassed by he's scared to send his employees home. I mean, so why didn't we anticipate the problem and start working toward we are living in one of the biggest cities in the world, and we can't find solutions to like help these communities. It's while we waste money on so many other foolish things, so I mean, I just feel like, why do we not have forward planning and forward thinking, knowing that something like this is going to come at us? And so, or we are 1 year into the pandemic, still nothing is being done to to start pumping resources into some of these communities that are hurting. I mean, people like hurt people. There's that phrase, hurt people, which basically means that there are communities across the city that are hurting from various things, from unemployment, from frustration, from COVID. They have lost loved ones. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on. And so people are lashing out. I'm not forgiving, or I'm not saying I'm just trying to understand where the resources need to be come in. And so the Federation is working on things like trying to get a community ambassador program going, trying to get victim services, trying to get a language access, trying to get getting the community themselves to start standing up for ourselves. No one's coming to save us here. So these are some of the things that we are working on right now.
Yeah. And also, one of the things that was so shocking to me, hearing Noel's story, was the fact that he got slashed in the face on an L train going to work and nobody helped him. He got off that train by himself and walked the entire length of the platform by himself, and got to the end and said, can somebody please call 911, right? And his story is, it's really hard not to cry when you hear it. It's really hard to think, my God, people are, and I'm gonna be gracious to my fellow New Yorkers to say, maybe it was a shock of seeing something so brutal happen in front of you that you don't know how to react. But, this is all about being upstanders, right? And I was explaining to staff, I remember reading those stories about, Kitty Genovese back in the day. That was the story, right? Like how she got killed in front of her own apartment building And all these neighbors heard her, and not one person called the cops or got help because they said, well, somebody else will do it, right? And that is what that Noel's story feels like. Nobody helped, nobody pitched in. It's not, yes, it's a shock, but we live in New York. Everything's a shock these days. Pizza Rat is a shock, right? You need to step out and to be able to say, are you okay? What do you need help with? How can I help you, right? Nobody did that. And for a man who is 61 years old, if you see his scars, you know how deep that wound went. And for him to walk the L train from end to end to go and say, can somebody call 911 for me? That is heartbreaking, but it is enraging, because why the hell didn't somebody stand up and say, oh my God, right? And so that is, I think for me, that is so shocking. It's so infuriating, right? We've all done random acts of kindness and for complete strangers. And yet, when something so horrible happens to somebody who's sitting in front of you, nobody bothered to regain their senses or even bother to say, let me help you. Let me get off the train with you and walk you, right? And make sure you get the help you need. Nobody did that. He had to navigate all of that by himself, which just is beyond belief for me right now.
I mean, talk about literal invisibilization, right? I mean, on a very, very, the worst forms of it. And I do remember being so shocked myself when he talked about that during his speech on Saturday. The way in which he's, like you said, not a single person came to help him, came to his aid in any way. And that brings up an audience question. I know that there's some questions in the chat too, so I want to make sure to get to them as well. And as we kind of move through this, so one of them, which I think ties in really well here, is when we talk about the role. The question is, what can I, as an individual, do to help in situations like these? And I think that AF has also talked a lot about, bystander, upstander intervention to put together some amazing graphics that illustrate this point as well. What does it mean? What does bystander intervention mean? I mean, JoAnn, you alluded to this right now, but what does that look like? And how can that be applied in situations like these? Because that's a way that anyone in a situation when they're present can be helpful and can be effective. But what does that exactly look like?
I think all of the, Center for Anti-Violence Education, this is their work. And, I want to always lift up my wonderful allies every chance I get. And I think they're definitely the experts. I think where I saw it in our community was after the sisters wearing hijabs were getting targeted on trains. And so, a lot of the, where the Federation learned that was because somebody actually said, I'm afraid to go to work on the train because people are harassing me, right? And so there was a whole training about, when you hear toxic language on the train, how do you de-escalate when voices get louder? There's actually things that you do to be able to cool down the situation, right? To be able to help the person standing next to you who's feeling vulnerable. And I don't talk about this much, but I have used those tactics before, right? I have pretended to know strangers that I really didn't know because I saw tense situations happening. It's to train ourselves in, to react, to be able to diffuse a really tense situation, a situation that can get really toxic. Two people I saw some videos where two people were actually fighting, right? And it's just exchange of words, it's like, you're this, and it just gets louder and louder. And then at some point, like you go from like 0 to 100 really quickly, right? And I've seen a YouTube video where there was actually, a bystander said, whoa, slow it down, calm down, keeping everybody down. And there are tactics that we can learn. We have a booklet. That's to be able to keep people calm and to get them back down to being, a little more logical, and cooling them down. And then there are, situations where, if there's physical violence, like call, you need to call for help. There are things that we can all do and not turn a blind eye. I think certainly, there are times I remember walking people home when people looked a little funny. They felt a little funny. You could just tell. And I said, can I walk you home? Right. Sometimes as a woman, it's easier to, offer that to another woman, they don't feel uncomfortable, right? There are things that we can all do, and I think as New Yorkers, we have to do it.
I trained in bystander intervention when the whole race stuff was happening, before, and it's absolutely, it's something as simple as standing up and going and standing next to somebody, just to and not dealing with the person who's yelling and screaming, but asking this person, are you okay? Just like, so that they know that they're not alone and they're not panicking, and not. And there's a lot of, there are many techniques, and there are experts who can teach you. And we actually have booklets that we've been putting out on bystander and de-escalation and all these things, and how to walk away from a situation instead of like going and fighting with people, how to move away in how to keep your body square and move away. There's lots of all these things, which again, is something that you actually have to sort of make sure that you learn. And if you, to your question, Shekar, what can New Yorkers do to help? One is become aware that, that you have a role to play in public, that you are a New Yorker, and that if something's happening, try and help the person, no matter what color they are. And, if it can be as simple as in Noel's case, calling 911 for him and standing there with him until the police came, or like trying to learn some of these techniques. The other thing I think is donate to organizations that are doing the work, because this is, everybody is under-resourced, and
Been doing
so, that is, donate to the people who are doing the work. If there's anything else you can't do, or tweet them, or just make sure people know about them. If you can't give money, I know everyone cannot give money, and that's fine too. It just seems that you have to be a little more, and I'm talking in a city which has been wonderful. We are talking about 10,000 volunteers right now who are helping people get appointments. We are talking about people who've been feeding people throughout the pandemic. So this city is an amazing city, and in many ways. At the same time, there are things like Noel Quintana that happen, where people just seem to walk away. So, it's hard to tell, but like each of us can do our part. And one of the things is go stand by someone who's being abused, and yeah.
And I'm glad, JoAnn, that you lifted up the Center for Anti-Violence Education too. Their trainings have been really excellent. And we've actually had some here, for those who may know too, in Jackson Heights. When we've done our MLK Day celebration every year, we've had bystander intervention trainings as part of that have been personally my favorite. And I know for those who have joined too, have found it really impactful for situations like these that JoAnn and Meera are both talking about. And I wanted to, another question, I see an audience question that's come up from our feed, but before, just giving some background here, one point you mentioned before, both of you, about the need to invest in, one, community organizations that have already been doing the work for so long, and two, investing in resources and services for our communities. And how important that is, right? Like we always, JoAnn, to your point, you always hear, oh, well, where's the money for these kinds of things? Well, if you look at how much our city spends on all these different things that they shouldn't be spending money on, or totally extraneous, it's not a question of, well, how can we create the resources? The resources are there. It's a question of, are we prioritizing things like mental health services, language access, right? And whatever the laws may say on paper, language access in the city when it comes to the courts, when it comes to government agencies, is appalling. Even legal services, right? Talk about victim service and legal services. Culturally accessible, linguistically accessible legal services for Asian communities does not exist in this city. And it's a huge, huge issue, right? You'll have tenants from, the Bronx, Korean tenants in the Bronx who will go to Minkwon and Flushing because that's where they feel most comfortable, taking the train across all the boroughs because of the lack of services. So that's such a powerful point that you mentioned, that, one question I have too, one of the audience questions with that background is, who can we demand accountability from? How do we demand, where do we go from here in that sense? Do we call the mayor? Do we call the governor? Who do we look to for accountability to help us bring in the services and resources that we need, that COVID has really exposed for everyone to see are so badly needed, and so has all of these hate crimes too?
I said yes, all of the above. You need to let your voices be heard, and it's civic civic engagement is not just at election time. That's every single day. You've got to like check in all the time. And I'm sure Chuck can weigh in here because he does that work. But like, it's not just election time and then you're done. It's like there are so many things that are happening now more than ever. Our voices are needed. The community boards, you can serve on your community boards, like everything. When I talk about civic engagement, people always say, oh, it's that's just politics. I'm not interested, right? And I say, well, politics, that sounds like, something I don't want to deal with. And I say, politics tells you where you get to live, who you get to associate with, what you eat, right? What train you ride, right? All of that, all of that. I think we need to be people need to be fearless and let their elected officials know. It's such an interesting thought that when people become your elected leader, people start to, people start to see these elected officials differently. And what I want to say is those people are elected officials because we elected them, right? And like, we need to be able to say, like, if you don't do a good job and if you don't make the right investments in the things that we care about as a community, we're going to vote you out. That needs to happen. And we need to be very firm in that belief, right? Because look at some of these elected officials who've been there. It's like their lifelong job, right? Yeah. Sometimes elected officials keep their, like maybe, I'm posing a question, maybe they're the problem to their community advancing. I don't know, right? But I think we need to pay attention. I think if something is wrong, I think you should pick up the phone and call people. I think you need to let people know. And it can't just be election year, except this year is our election year. And it's going to be really critical because we have a mayoral race coming up, right? City council, all the so many races coming up. It's critical for people to participate. If you sit it out and if you don't, help out, if you don't go to the polls, there isn't, then why bother? Like, we're not going to engage you. I speak to so many people in so many groups. And, even in social settings, a lot of young people say, oh, I really admire what you do. Can you, and they always want to talk about what their political thoughts are, right? And the first question I ask every single person is, oh, so do you vote, right? And if the answer is no, I say, then we cannot have this conversation, right? Unless you're a citizen and if you don't vote, because that means you don't give a crap about your community. And so like, I'm not going to entertain foolishness from somebody who doesn't even bother to go out and like pull a lever to say, this is the person that I want to help transform my community, right? I think we need to be really diligent in that. Our civic engagement is really, it's your time that's an investment in your community, in a much larger context, and we need to engage with that. And I see Anthony Ng, and Anthony Ng used to do this work, and I know that he's written big fat papers, 20, 30 pages at somewhere in my, in my bookshelf, but he knows this work too, and he's done this work before. There are a lot of different things that we have to do, but more than anything else, we have to let our voices be heard, right? And especially now, with we live in immigration mixed status communities, and so sometimes the votes that we cast, it's even more critical because we're casting the vote for people who can't actually go to the polls themselves, right? And so especially in Jackson Heights, that's probably like one of the best slices of what New York is supposed to be about, right? And there's been some really great progressive political thinking coming out of your neighborhood, that because people are so engaged. How do we transform, how do we get that and like transform it to other share with other communities so other people are engaged? That's like the $1 million question.
So Anthony has a question in the chat, and he's asking that we speak more about the community ambassador program. So Anthony, it's being done in Oakland now, and as we understand it, and I want to make a caveat that we are still trying to to sort of make sure we know how it's going to be in New York City, because every city is different. What the community ambassador program is, that the community escorts, like there are people chosen from the community, people who are well known in the community, who become volunteers, and they escort people, like especially seniors, say, who are afraid to say go to the grocery store. So they say, I'll walk with you, and they are also well known in the community, and they speak the language, and they are basically there as sort of like in an intercessionary way. They're basically that people can go to them when they have a problem, and they are, they can code switch in that sense. They speak the language of the community, they know the community, they are upstanders in the community, and they can sort of help with those problems. That's how I understand this particular thing that's happening. And JoAnn, isn't that what we are trying to do? Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, like an investment in first of all trying to find these community ambassadors, making sure they have language access, making sure the rest of the community knows. So,
right.
Yeah.
And it's not just for the Asian American community. Once you set up a system where people talk to each other, know each other, recognize each other, it's not just for the safety of the Asian American community, it's the safety of all community, right? Yep. Because the sad thing about all of this is that this is not going to end with the Asian American community. Something's going to happen where some other community is going to get scapegoated, right? And we need to prepare for that. Just like we also need to prepare that COVID is not going to be the only time we're going to have a global pandemic. We're going to have other issues coming up. When Anthony and I used to work together, it was like SARS in Chinatown, and people would just say horrific things to the Chinese people. And we worked together, and like, people would say, oh my God, you can't even, somebody actually had to, spit and somebody's, some elder spit and somebody screamed, this is why we have SARS, blah, 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 blah. And I was just like, it was just horrifying to watch that. Right. So I realized like, oh yeah, it's going to happen again. It's going to come back around. Right. And tomorrow it's going to be somebody else's community, but I will tell you, I will be ready to help that community. Right.
But what has been, to look at the kind of the bright side of all of this, right? Like, I mean, having this rally, us screaming all the time, has really helped to raise community awareness of what's going on, not just in New York or in San Francisco, but across the country.
Absolutely.
This rally and other rallies that are happening in San Francisco have really concentrated the attention. And JoAnn was talking earlier about raising our voices. This is exactly what happens when you raise your voice. Suddenly people are like, oh, we have to pay attention. The whole issue has been amplified now by all these influencers and people, and suddenly every single corporation and I mean, from GoFundMe to Pepsi to Peloton to everybody now wants like a piece of the action. They want to amplify it. They want to do it. And so this is what happened with George Floyd, and this brought a lot of good stuff in the sense of just actually making people aware that racism exists. And that is the same thing that's happening, I think, to some extent here. Mm-hmm. That now suddenly people are paying attention, but someone has to raise that voice to say, look, we're not going to just keep quiet anymore, and I think that this rally was our way of doing that, which, no matter what, it's COVID or whatever, that's what we wanted to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it wasn't our favorite idea to do a rally in a global pandemic, right? And so few of us got the vaccine, but we knew we had to do it. And what was really shocking about the turnout actually was that I thought it'd be a lot of like nonprofit organization staff coming. It was a lot of people from the community who just needed to come out and say, this is happening to my community, and I want to stand in solidarity. And that's what was really, really moving. But I also realized it was the release that our community needed to be able to say, I'm not going to stand for this, right? That's what was really important for us.
And for all the sadness about Noel Quintana, what was also amazing to see that New Yorkers of every color came out to the rally, and that was really sort of great for us to see, and for Noel to see that there was like this wide diverse people from New York City who were there.
I think, and I remember that very vividly from this past weekend too, which, you know, it was really, like you said, it was really heard, that message was heard around the world. And, you know, you and I talked about that too, about the number of, amount of outreach going to AF after this rally as well. But I think, what'd you say?
We are very, very tired. We've not been sleeping. Because like JoAnn has done back-to-back interviews for, I don't know, for the last, I don't know how many days. I mean, it's insane.
I don't know how you do it, JoAnn, but yeah, I know you've been doing it. But it's so necessary, you know, like you said too, it was during the global pandemic, but the same way with the BLM rallies last summer, it had to be done to call attention to these issues and bring us all together. And to, you know, and I think as Junia said too, BLM raised voices across the world. That's absolutely true. And I think that's so necessary. And that's where I would, I want to end on one question. Well, one point first is say, I think your point about voting is so important, not just for those who have the right and don't exercise it, which is just so abhorrent on many levels, but that we need to be really in New York City, I believe, making sure that every immigrant has the right to vote, regardless of immigration status, because so many are systematically excluded, their voices excluded and invisibilized because they don't have the right to franchise too. And I think that that's such an important point that you made. So I wanted to just emphasize that. But the last question I wanted to really, you know, to ask you that is to flip the question back on us as Asian American communities too, because you sort of touched on this, JoAnn, Meera too, when we talked about BLM, we talked about solidarity. We also talked about the model minority myth and how there are those in our communities who really buy, you know, fully into the model minority myth. What is our responsibility as Asian Americans to stand in solidarity and fight with our Black and other brown communities that are suffering so much from racism in every aspect of our society? I thought that would be a good point for you to touch on. When you talk about solidarity, what is our responsibility as Asian American communities, and why is that so important?
To fight with all the racists in our own house. I mean, you know, let's just admit it. Like, there are racists in every community. It's not as if we don't have racists in our community. I mean, you know, we have that famous, the mythical uncle at our table at Thanksgiving who's also saying bad things about every other community. We have a responsibility to teach our own communities that, you know, racism is not okay, that racism hurts everybody, that it takes away resources from everyone, you know, it not just from our communities, that if we are racist and seen as racist, and that, first of all, it you know, blocks our own like ability to see that we can only function as a community, that we, you know, whatever is going on here, we have to sort of work together. Otherwise, we are not going to get ahead. And the moment you say, I want to get mine and get out of here and never mind all the other people, then that's not going to help, you know. I mean, it's we have to start with our own uncles and aunties and you know, to stop the racism. And we know it exists in our way. Nobody is perfect. So,
and in our own, we have to acknowledge, because you have to give credit where credit is due, right? Asian Americans have, you know, have so much. We have gained all of the, you know, the rights and the, you know, the civic, you know, everything that we have based on the Black community. They're the ones who pitched that tent for us, right? The fact that we get to vote, civil rights, Black community, right? So much. And I will say too, that I think people always see the Black and Asian community as a disparate, like, you know, like, oh, these are the communities that never interact and they never help each other. You know, I've been sharing the story of Vincent Chen, right? And a lot of us know, you know, that story, you know, that he was killed because of racism, because he was an auto worker in Detroit, and it was like a week before his wedding, and he's out at a bachelor party, and you know, the auto industry was really angry at the Japanese car companies because they were more efficient, right? So here's this Chinese guy going into a bachelor party, and so they said, we're going to kill him, right? Because they thought he was Japanese, right? And that his death became a local issue. It was a Detroit issue. It was a local issue. Never got any national traction. who brought the national attraction? Jesse Jackson brought that national attraction because Jesse Jackson was running for president. And he heard that story and he was outraged by that. He flew to Detroit and brought the national press with him. And that, his attention, him shining a light on a really, really horrific story of, this young man. That's what started the modern Asian American social justice movement. So many great groups sprang out of there, leaders sprang out of there. We've benefited from, we'd be foolish to not admit that we've benefited from the Black community, right? The immigration stuff, we benefited from the Latino community, and some other community will benefit from some of the work that we do, right? But that's how it's supposed to be. You're supposed to do things together and work together to make a better society. And when I say some of these things these days, I feel like I totally sound like a Pollyanna, right? Like, yes, this is going to be our utopia, but to be honest, if we don't even try, then what good is it, right? Like, at least we need to figure out, maybe we will never get to that point where we all, have the kind of world that we envision, but, shouldn't we all die trying, because when I saw at the rally of like all the little kids who came out, I was like, I hope they never have to experience what we are experiencing, because I hope they never have to have their own rallies about, Asian Americans getting hurt, that's ultimately the, ultimate audience. I think it really is to leave a better world for our children, so that way they don't make some of the foolish mistakes that we adults have made. So.
I think you said it so beautifully, JoAnn. And I think it's that kind of fundamental, really bottom up, deep down solidarity that we need, whether it's fighting for Black lives or fighting against anti-Asian hatred. It's so fundamental that is the kind of collaboration and arm in arm, hand in hand solidarity that we need to see and be there for each other. Because you're right, it's a world we're fighting for our children. And it's a world that if it's utopian, if it is too idealistic, well, it's worth giving everything we've got and fighting for that world, because what other kind of world can we believe in or fight for? And I think that, it's moments like these. I think when you look at the rally you all held this past weekend, or the BLM marches last summer, that show how important it is for all of us to be engaged in this effort too. So thank you for making those points too. And I just wanted to conclude tonight by saying thank you both so much. JoAnn, Meera, the work you all are doing every single day is just so powerful and inspiration for all of us in this city about what we can all do as individuals too. And I think tonight's discussion and the points you both made are just a testament to that too. So I want to thank you both. And I want to thank all of you for attending today too, to have these conversations and these honest conversations about the work ahead of us, what we all need to do too. So thank you all for joining tonight. And thank you, JoAnn and Meera, so much for what you all do every single day. I admire you both so much.
Thank you for inviting us. It's great seeing my friends.
Yeah, added bonus.
Thank you
I
all
love
for
this community. Thanks, guys. Keep safe.
Thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe. Thank you for joining tonight.
You guys, let's get together soon.